So I'm here today with Dr. Edward Cliff, and he's currently at ASCO, and we're really excited to talk about the latest advances in lymphoma research and the hot topics that everyone's talking about lymphoma at ASCO this year. To kick off, could I ask Dr. Cliff, would you mind just giving a quick introduction to who you are, what you're passionate about, and maybe a little bit about your career journey?
So my name's Eddie. I'm an Australian-trained haematology registrar with a focus on malignant haematology, particularly myeloma and lymphoma. And I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Brigham Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School, looking at particularly health policy and the intersection of pharmaceutical policy, clinical trial design, and haematology and oncology.
Super. It's really exciting to talk to you today, and really interested in diving into ASCO. I'm just going to kick off by asking, what are the hot topics that everyone's talking about at ASCO in lymphoma this year?
So yeah, we're fresh out of the lymphoma session about half an hour ago, so it's very much hot off the press. And it has been a very exciting ASCO for the lymphomaniacs around. The most exciting and most practice-changing, I think, was featured in the plenary session, which is the SWOG S1826 randomized trial of Nivolumab plus AVD versus Rituximab vedotin versus AVD in upfront treatment of Hodgkin lymphoma. Hodgkin lymphoma, as many of you will know, is particularly common in younger patients. And although outcomes are very good, we always want to make outcomes better. And so this was a cooperative group study in the US that looked at combining checkpoint inhibitor immunotherapy in the form of Nivolumab with the chemotherapy backbone. They gave 6 cycles of either Nivo-AVD or Rituximab vedotin AVD. And the headline result is that the progression-free survival was even better than I think I expected. There was a very early difference in that trial, and so it was read out and presented earlier than expected in favor of the Nivolumab arm, in favor of the immunotherapy arm. And in addition to an efficacy benefit, there was clear toxicity benefit as well. So it was less toxic, particularly in terms of peripheral neuropathy for patients with Nivolumab who received the Nivolumab. And so, you know, it's kind of early days. There's obviously no overall survival difference just yet. But I think despite that, given the kind of robustness of the study, it's a cooperative group study, it's a big study, given the lower toxicity and given the improvement in progression-free survival for patients and for countries that can access that drug, Nivolumab, in the frontline setting, to me, that's a practice-changing study. And particularly for younger patients, the likelihood of reducing kind of long-term toxicity is really exciting. The second study that really, I guess, would say is practice affirming, but is particularly important outside the US, where many funding agencies are very interested in overall survival. A lot of, in the US, kind of progression-free survival is usually enough to get your drug approved and funded, but a lot of funding agencies, such as in the UK or in Australia, are very keen to have overall survival data. And this was presented yesterday in a special late-breaking abstract session, and this was the overall survival data in the ZUMA-7 trial, which was a randomized phase 3 trial of CAR T-cell therapy, that is axi-cell, in the second-line setting in diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, the most common aggressive lymphoma. And so these patients compared axi-cell CAR T against standard of care, which was salvage chemotherapy, combination chemotherapy, followed by an autologous transplant. Again, very well run, this time industry sponsored, but very well run large phase 3 study. And at ASH in 2021, we heard that there was a progression-free survival benefit, but in an aggressive lymphoma like diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, you really want to know, is it going to change overall survival, something that really matters to patients? And indeed, that's what we heard yesterday, that there was a substantial difference in overall survival. That is, if you got CAR T-cell in the second-line therapy, you lived longer. You had a higher chance of being alive at 2 years than if you received the chemotherapy arm of the trial. Now, one very small caveat is that there was not crossover built into the design of that trial, which is kind of a bit of an equity issue, but fortunately, the majority of patients still were able to cross over in the control arm to receive CAR T therapy. I think despite that kind of small ethical oversight, or big ethical but small, big ethical oversight, there was a kind of small impact on the trial interpretability. And so I think that's still a very robust result that is practice affirming in the US and should be practice changing for funders around the world, although of course CAR T cells are still very expensive, so that's another challenge to tackle, but another very exciting result. The next trial that I thought was really kind of impressive and practice changing was just presented just now, the IELSG 37 trial, which is the Italian cooperative group in primary mediastinal B-cell lymphoma, which is a relatively rare lymphoma isolated to the mediastinum, an area you're familiar with, which is commonly occurs in younger women. And so that becomes important because historically that's been treated with radiotherapy. And so in addition to cardiac and lung toxicity, you also have breast cancer risk with radiation to the chest in young women, of course. And so this was the largest ever trial in primary mediastinal B-cell lymphoma. And it sought to see if they could see if we still need to give radiotherapy in patients who have PET negative disease after 6 cycles of induction chemotherapy. Now, there's still some controversy in primary mediastinal B-cell lymphoma around the best chemotherapy regimen. Many people believe, and in many cases believe strongly, that the standard R-CHOP, which we use in other aggressive lymphoma like DLBCL, isn't enough in PMBCL. But although there aren't randomized data to support that, the actual data from this particular trial kind of affirmed that among the physicians in the study, there was quite a diverse range of different chemotherapies used, indicating that the field kind of hasn't agreed on one universal chemotherapy backbone. But again, data from this trial kind of do suggest, if not definitively, that something more aggressive than R-CHOP is probably warranted, but not definitive. But the kind of headline from that study was that although they came to realize sort of halfway through the study that if they wanted to prove the non-inferiority margin that they had set out to prove, which just for listeners who may or may not be aware, a non-inferiority trial that seeks to show that one strategy is non-inferior to the other trial often requires a bigger sample size than a superiority trial. But that does depend on the non-inferiority margin. And so, as best I could appreciate from the presentation which we just had, they did some kind of what seemed to me very reasonable statistics, and that again seemed pretty convincing to me based on what I saw, that indeed we can omit radiotherapy in the patients who achieve PET negativity at cycle 6. Now, there is an additional cohort of people who have kind of a false positive PET scan at the end of cycle 6. That is, the PET lights up, but really there's not disease there. When you biopsy them, you don't find residual disease, and they have a very good outcome. And this study didn't really, certainly in what was presented today, didn't really address that cohort of patients. And so I think ideally it would be great to be able to omit radiotherapy in that group of patients too. But still very impressive to run such a large, again, cooperative group, robust study in radiation oncology, which is harder to get funded than when you've got a novel drug and a company to pay for it. And that looked at de-escalating care in a kind of young group of patients where long-term toxicity is really important if we can avoid. The next one that I thought was really will, I'm sure, generate some controversy from the session just now, was from the French cooperative group, the LYMA trial, which was the 7-year follow-up of this trial. This is a trial in mantle cell lymphoma, which is, again, a rarer type of typically aggressive, but it can vary in its aggressiveness lymphoma. Represents about 5 to 7% of lymphomas. And this trial looked at whether there was a benefit in adding maintenance rituximab. So after you have your induction chemotherapy, should you then receive maintenance rituximab every 3 months for 3 years? And interestingly, it had previously shown both a kind of substantial benefit in both progression-free survival and overall survival. But today's presentation with updated 7-year follow-up actually showed that overall survival benefit has faded, and there's no longer an overall survival benefit. And although it's very difficult to tell why that is, one hypothesis is that some of the novel therapies such as Bruton tyrosine kinase inhibitors and CAR T cell therapy are making an impact for the patients that do relapse. it does seem that the patients who relapse in the maintenance rituximab arm relapse with more aggressive disease. And so I think while it didn't quite sway me away from what I think still does seem to benefit patients in maintenance rituximab, it did make me think that now, if you're in a setting where there's some issue, whether that be access or patient concerns or toxicity, that it is actually now a reasonable thing, it's not now not compulsory, I guess, to pursue maintenance rituximab, although it still does seem, the progression-free survival benefit is still robust. It's becoming, there are biosimilars available for rituximab in many parts of the world. And so it does still seem like a very reasonable thing to continue doing, even if this overall survival benefit has faded. The last study I picked out, I'm sure will also generate plenty of controversy, and that was, I should mention that the SWOG study, ZUMA-7, were both out in the New England Journal yesterday, and this study I'm about to mention now, the Transcend CLL04, was out in the Lancet today. And that was really the biggest and kind of most complete or most detailed data we have for the use of CAR T-cell therapy in chronic lymphocytic leukemia, or CLL. And very much a mixed bag in that there were a small group of patients who did very well. And, I guess with more time, we'll see just how well, but there were some people whose disease really melted away with CAR T-cell therapy. And in CLL, that's tricky because you often get T-cell dysfunction inherent in the disease itself. And so actually manufacturing CAR T-cells has been particularly challenging in CLL, which is why even though people were treated in trials of CAR T-cells with CLL more than 10 years ago, there's still no CAR T-cell product on the market for CLL. So because of this challenge around T-cells. So yeah, so the reason I say that it was mixed is that while there was a small group of patients that did very well and look like they've had very good responses, although it's very early to be sure of that, there were a lot of patients who had these kind of mixed responses where some of the disease melted away, but some of it stayed there. And there was a bit of debate between the audience questions and the presenter as to how meaningful that was, whether the endpoints we were using truly captured that, whether we should be thinking about things differently, or whether the kind of tried and true tested endpoints that we know in CLL are still the right ones to use. And so without kind of taking sides, I guess cautious optimism is the readout there. And it's very hard to know what will happen from a regulatory approval standpoint, i.e. will CAR T be approved based on this data in CLL in the US? Very hard to say. So they were the kind of 5 top lymphoma picks, I guess, from ASCO that I picked out. And I think particularly the Hodgkin lymphoma trial is very exciting and immediately practice changing. And ZUMA-7 is also very exciting, especially for places where they kind of depend on that overall survival to get reimbursement.
Super interesting. Thank you so much, Eddie, for that really comprehensive summary of some really great papers that have been published in this space. And you've been talking just today about CAR T, right? And would you mind giving us a little summary of what you were talking about today with regards to CAR T as well?
Yeah, so I presented in an education session called Cars of the Future, and the 2 colleagues of mine who presented in that session presented about CAR NK cells and CAR T cells for brain tumors, sort of looking at where to. And my talk was focused on kind of how much CAR T cells or cellular therapies cost to manufacture, how you can appraise therapies for their value when they get incredibly expensive, as CAR T is, and looking at the different components of the costs of CAR T and how we might be able to bring each of those components down. And so to give a very taste tester of what that was about, we looked at the manufacturing costs, how you might bring the manufacturing costs down, such as through allogeneic products. I looked at the price and how you might bring the price charged by the manufacturer down, such as through price negotiation. And then the third bucket I looked at was the bundle payments that are particularly an issue in the US, where CAR T is billed by the hospital to the insurer as a bundled payment. And so sometimes those bundled payments can be upwards of $1 million. So even where the CAR T cell therapy might be billed as $400,000 or $500,000, which is already extremely expensive, sometimes the hospitals are billing the insurer more than $1 million per patient. And obviously that as you get hopefully more and more CAR T products available, becomes very unsustainable very quickly.
super important topic, right? How do we make this accessible? And
I should mention that we've got we'll have an education book article coming out as part of the ASCO education book, and that will be open access and available through the ASCO website.
Amazing. And then looking forward to the next 12 months, what are the hot topics that we should be expecting to see everyone talking about with regards to lymphoma? What do you think are the most important bits of research that are currently taking place, and perhaps a glimpse of what we might see of ASCO 2024?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the bispecific antibodies definitely have to be top of that list, because they kind of take this excitement we've had with CAR T cells and they make it much more readily available, and hopefully one day much cheaper, because it's, you've just got a kind of off-the-shelf product that, as we've seen with Rituximab, which is a monoclonal antibody that really has made it to many parts of the world. I would hope that the same thing will be true of bispecific antibodies. And these are, I always talk about them a bit like Tinder. So they bring the T cell to the malignant cell. They've got two binding sites, and they sort of matchmake the T cell and or most of them target T cells, and matchmake the T cell with the malignant cell, and sort of bring them together and lead the T cell to kind of destroy the tumor cell. And they work particularly well in lymphoma. They're available in a range of diseases, particularly lymphoma and also myeloma. And I think there's lots of evolving data there. And so what will be great will be to see the randomized trials start to happen of those therapies to really help us know when and how to use them. But I think that's kind of top of the list in terms of exciting things on the horizon. The other thing that comes to mind, thinking a bit about primary mediastinal B-cell lymphoma today with that radiation therapy study, is that there's a trial underway looking at the use of checkpoint inhibitors again in primary mediastinal B-cell lymphoma, because that's a particularly sensitive type of lymphoma. And so I wonder if sometime in the near future we'll be also adding the PD-1 inhibitors to upfront therapy in primary mediastinal B-cell lymphoma, as you've just heard we will likely be doing with Hodgkin lymphoma.
Eddie, thank you so much for a really comprehensive summary of 5 great papers in lymphoma, a glimpse into your own presentation on how do we make CAR T more accessible, and then looking forward to 2024 and the exciting work that's already happening. We really appreciate your time today, and thanks for sharing what's happening at ASCO with colleagues who couldn't make it.
Thanks for having me.